noise. So without further ado, I would like to, let me stop sharing my screen here, and I will let Professor Michelle Thompson, who teaches courses in GIS, environmental justice, community development, finance, housing, transportation, urban studies, neighborhood and land use planning. She received a master's in regional planning and a doctorate from Cornell University with a focus on community development and spatial analysis using GIS. Professor Thompson received a Bachelor of Arts in Policy Studies from the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs from Syracuse in 1982. She obtained her GIS Systems Professional Certification in 2015, and she was a Senior Data Fellow with the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. And not to be underlooked, my wife was a student of hers and absolutely loved her class. So without further ado, Michelle, welcome to virtual FAU presentation.
Great. Thank you so much, John, and certainly Serena and everyone who's joining us. And I'm definitely going to do a sound check. I'm certainly can hear me okay? Great. So I definitely will need a 5-minute warning, John, because as I always tell my students, I teach a 2-hour and 40-minute class, and I can talk the whole time. So we're going to make sure that I stay on task and get us going here. So again, I'm Dr. Michelle Thompson, and I came to New Orleans in 2007, close to 2008. I'm from Central New York, so you can tell I don't have the great Southern accent. And I came down to New Orleans because I was there to help in the lower 9th Ward, and then as a consultant trying to help gather data, and then got the great opportunity between 2007, 2008 to join the university. And my focus then, as it is now, is to figure out how we can get data into the hands of the community so they can empower themselves, how to figure out how to teach our students how to be better planners and citizens, and to be able to advance the field in a lot of ways. So this story that I'm about to tell you weaves a bit of our planning history, our planning policy, and what's happening today in the livable Claiborne corridor in New Orleans. So I'm glad I'm talking to planners and transportation folks. I'll try not to use too many acronyms, but to start, the picture on the left is of the Claiborne corridor in a section that runs through much of the area that I'll be talking about today. And those trees that are there are no longer there. You can see the interstate runs through, and as many cities across the United States in the 1960s, there was a lot of suburbanization. Those trees were at the time the largest collection of live oaks in North America. They were decimated, along with over 300 Black-owned businesses. And make sure I can advance. I was going to say next slide, but I'm the one who's doing it. So there we go. So what I'm going to dive down into is that, while we're focusing in on this transportation, there are equity issues all along the way. Even in the 1960s, the idea that the businesses and the citizens living in New Orleans and Interstate 10 didn't have a voice and a choice. So I'm going to use some of these dates, and some of the data certainly could be up to date, but planning takes a long time, and we have what we have. But in terms of context, Claiborne Avenue, top left, runs from one end of the city to the other. It links the city to the parishes and the downtown. It serves as a really important truck route, and it currently, it still is designated as an evacuation route. In 2012, and I know there's more current statistics, but as a comprehensive photo, Interstate 10 and 610, which is adjacent and connecting, had an increase from 69,500 vehicles in 2008 to 115,000 in 2012. I'm certain there's more. That's just to emphasize that it is an intensively used roadway. But things changed. There was an idea, and there's been many plans, that what happened to cities in terms of segmenting them, segregating them, destroying neighborhoods and communities, the idea was then, well, maybe we should revisit the plan around keeping interstates, and in particular, Interstate 10 elevated. So I always like to say, besides FEMA, I think planning is a dirty word in New Orleans, because a planning study, which took about $1.2 million, was put forth and was paid for to study whether the bridge should be up or down. In the end, the idea was that, the highway was to remain up. There were a lot of scenarios and a lot of plans. On the bottom left, there were a lot of transportation plans that focus on different routes and different ways to move traffic in and around the neighborhood. But what was really exciting about that time in the top right is that we weren't just talking about transportation. We're also talking about holistic development. Now people will call them, the complete streets. But there was a major development that was going to happen. The big four, these are the Section 8 housing, the federal housing. Some of them had been mothballed. They were going to be potentially revisited, torn down. A major construction of the Louisiana State University Medical Center and VA then took mega blocks, removed even other parts of the neighborhood, but that was going to be major investment. They wanted to keep green space. So what was interesting about these different studies is that it provided an amazing laboratory for John, the students at the university. And that's why I follow John a lot of different ways. And so he was still is a great colleague in terms of being ahead of the time. So that's my plug for John. But what was really important is because I was not a native. I was not a New Orleanian. I didn't know, after Katrina, the whole city needed to be revamped, rehabbed. But there was a study that was done in 2011 with John and his students that really started to look at the precedents in other cities of what happens when you keep the bridge up. Talked to the businesses, went into the neighborhoods, and was able to really put together a really interesting packet of information that not only helped the city and the policymakers begin to think and rethink how they are going to approach this issue, but also to provide case studies, which is what I needed, and also the community to be able to figure out what they wanted. And that's really the nature and the design of my work, is that while folks are concerned about the G word, gentrification, they are more concerned about their housing and their jobs and how can we mitigate flooding. And so while the goal was and is to come up with a plan to make the livable Claiborne corridor better, there were already systemic issues of racial bias, lack of investment. And now you're going to infuse hundreds, thousands, millions of community development block grant dollars in areas where investments had not been and continued to not be for a variety of reasons. So I brought this map up from Richard Campanellis from Tulane University. And he has a lot of different maps that I've used over the years. But what I really like about this map, he's calling this the white teapot. You can kind of see the shape where there is still racial segregation by neighborhood. This is, that's a whole nother, discussion, but the reality is that there's New Orleans is wonderful, but the development patterns and the racial patterns, there's physical and economic segregation. So what happens then when you infuse a lot of different resources in areas that were previously risky and investors don't want to participate in? And the plans didn't necessarily involve or engage citizens. So that's where the equity issues came in. And I thought that what was really neat is in the last comprehensive plan, what was mandated by law was community engagement. And with that meant that the community needed to have ways of understanding planning processes, understanding planning data information. And that's where the work that I had been doing with the university came into play. And so my connection was learning about the community, but working with and for. My classes that I would teach, one of them was an introduction to GIS, Geographic Information Systems. And as part of this, I would teach students in the first half, like John said, Kara and his wife. And in the second half, we would engage with a nonprofit organization. All of this to provide professional planning services for free. Now, in 16 weeks, I am still, John, the professor they love to hate, because this takes a lot of work, a lot of organization. But it also means that if we're going to do the work, we have to be in the community and listen to what the community wants. That is the philosophy that we like to teach. But how do you do it in actuality? So in the bottom right, this Ujima Economic Development Corporation started is the recent name, but what we began to look at first is how can we map out what that now livable Claiborne corridor is. It doesn't include the all of Claiborne Avenue. And this boomerang shape was designed by the policymakers and planners in order to say, these are the areas that were hit hardest, have had systemic issues with poverty. We want to have a real comprehensive plan and to be able to work really closely with the community. Within that area, and as also one of the plans that came out of the big $1 million study, was the idea of figuring out how do we live with and under the bridge? Well, people in New Orleans were doing that already. You can see in the bottom right, there are informal and formal parties and art and music and second lines. And they've been doing this for years. It was the planners that needed to catch up to figure out what it is and how we can make sure that it can remain sustainable. So that yellow area that's, it says I-10 interstate, is what's known as the Claiborne Corridor Cultural Innovation District, or CID. It's a 19-block area underneath the Interstate 10 that the federal government, I'll put in air quotes, gave to the city of New Orleans. It now is under the management and care of the city. And the idea was that this was going to have a special taxation district to encourage the businesses that were previously there, that we're going to make sure that the culture bearers and the artists and those who wanted to be able to come back into the neighborhood actually were the first in with different resources, funding. And that's where the idea of how do we develop that CID and make sure that we're not only bringing those businesses back, but not also adding to what was really a big concern, gentrification. Another big issue for the work that I do and have done is how do we make sure that the data aligns with what the policymakers can know and understand, and we can integrate current information about demographic and economics, because we know the census information, it's as good as we have, but it's static. And most people in the neighborhoods don't talk about themselves as being in census tract 22071, right? They talk about being in Holy Cross or Lower Ninth Ward. So a really important part of the work that in order to make sure that we are bringing together the information and the data, that it is trusted by the city planners and we can bring those data sets together, is by integrating the data and doing quality control and quality analysis. And that's, again, another level of information that a lot of community are like, well, this is interesting, Michelle, but what's it going to do for me? Well, what it does, it provides information and a level playing field when it comes to being able to engage with the public, with investors, and certainly to be able to, which is exciting, to be able to get other philanthropy. As a result of some of the mapping and the analysis that we were able to do, the city of New Orleans, which has a qualified opportunity zones, was able to get some additional investment and monies to help with business training and also to be able to have technical assistance. So I'll stop for a moment. I just have to probably explain, this is going to be the worst and the quickest review of what's a US federal qualified opportunity zone, why it's important. There are, and I'll make sure I check my number, there are 8,764 qualified opportunity zones in the United States. There are 25 in New Orleans. During the Obama administration, this idea came up with, how can we have investors and give them an incentive to invest in these neighborhoods that are in the LCC or in the CID, Livable Claiborne Corridor, Claiborne Innovation District. But it was the next administration that was actually able to get that to come forth, and through taxation was able to say to investors, if you hold whatever amount of money for 10 years, you don't have to pay taxes on it. It can be brick and mortar, and it can also be a business concept within the census tracts, within the neighborhoods that obviously the city is trying to invest in. So I didn't know much about QOZs, and so that began to be a great opportunity to create, on the bottom right, a study of what are qualified opportunity zones. Where are they? How can cities market them? What's the status? So we had students producing that report, and also go even deeper and do studies and surveys and do some analytics around, there's still properties that are still have, even now, because of the storms, blue tarps, but even they're still Katrina affected. A lot of the work that has been done when it comes back to the issue of equity, for me, means that having the data, having the resources in the hands of community means that they have the ability and the opportunity to really go and get what they need. So the big piece of the theory that I work under is not something that I created. It really comes from the 80s, around the 80s, of public participation geographic information systems. Many of you, if I saw you, your heads are probably nodding. We know about all that. But what is it like in practice? It's not easy. To be able to get community to come, you probably end up with the same folks, yelling about the same things. To be able to get public data out, it wasn't until, as I recall, until after Hurricane Katrina and a lot of major changes. I mean, I really do credit the Mayor Mitch Landrieu administration for putting forth public data in a consumable way for us to integrate the information. But the key for me, in order to say, how do we really know what's going on now in terms of the businesses, and how can we track spending? How can we encourage investment, is getting the private data. So in 2018, I got the opportunity to work with New America as a public interest technology fellow, and MasterCard underwrote that research project. And the research project, again, the shorter version is, I wanted to see if we could look at 30 years of first-time homebuyer data by a nonprofit, map it, see what the first mortgages are in the investment. We were able to do that. And I said, that's great, but that took a year. Okay, so what can we do in terms of getting some MasterCard spending data so we can see what's happening over time, and add that into the mix in neighborhoods that are typically cash-based, don't have a lot of investment. So again, a lot of years have gone on in my life. And so I'm going to say another year later, after 12 lawyers and a lot of different discussion, I was able to join MasterCard Center as this data researcher for the purposes of being able to see anonymized and aggregated data. Again, there's a lot of information. I'm going to do it in my shortest version, and I'll make sure, John, I'm checking on my time, about 10 minutes. Okay. So What's interesting about MasterCard Center, it is a subsidiary, they don't like to use that word, of MasterCard. When MasterCard got millions and gazillions of dollars through that wonderful administration's tax plan, excuse me, they then created a nonprofit. This nonprofit and the goal of the nonprofit was really to try to provide resources to and for the public, and their greatest resource was data. So the idea was for New Orleans was to see how can we get the data. At first I wanted all the data, but they said, okay, a little bit of data. But if you can imagine your receipt that you get from a store, I'll just say Walmart, your name is not on it. That's the one-on-one data. Now, MasterCard, I didn't know this, doesn't give out credit cards. It collects all the data that your credit card company provides, not your name, but it gives all the information on where you spent, how you spent, what you spent it on, what zip code, whether it was virtual or place-based. If you can ever imagine all the kind of data around the world and every nanosecond being collected, what I wanted was at least 3 years of data on a monthly basis. They've got it down to weekly basis by census tract, by 19 blocks to look at changes in spending patterns over time. Well, it took 60 data scientists about 6 months and then 72 hours of a datathon to aggregate all of that information and put it together. And you can see the different departments and folks. And I was able to share with you just today 2 of the findings that are the kind of the big wows that came out of the study and why they're important. I keep wanting to bring in the issue of equity again, because I'm the only data scientist out of the 6 who was able to actually get any of MasterCard's data out over 2 years. And that's not good. I mean, I understand the reasons, but there are going to be more, John Rennie, that we are going to make sure that other researchers and other community members now have a platform to be able to go in and get this data after you sign away your 2 children. Okay, so here's the first big wow, which was really interesting. And please, folks, forgive the colors. Those are MasterCard dot colors. But what those indicate are the new businesses, and this data was collected only using MasterCard data. Qualification, we don't have the information on cash. We don't have Visa. We don't have other credit card information. But MasterCard is one of the largest data credit card providing services. So in 2015, 175 new businesses came into the livable Claiborne corridor. 2016, 188, 2017, 235, and 2018, 337. This was pretty amazing for folks from the NOLA Business Alliance and even the community to realize, like, they can only see from their block, but to see an aggregate that there's substantial growth, including the far right, the lower 9th ward, which still does not have a fully functioning grocery store. And the next. Okay, come on, computer. All righty. Okay, here's the other wow that came up. So the great thing that during this period of time that I worked with them, they started trying to come up with new tools that were free and freely accessible that would use their spending data. So they came up with a tool called Geo Insights, which you have access to. You can look up Geo Insights and you can look in, they have data sets and information, of course, anonymized and aggregated. And while our study really focused only from 2015 to 2018, because we went on to another project that I'll mention shortly, what was really fascinating is to be able to compare the spending habits and patterns for the city, the corridor, and that 19 block area. It showed that the CID, and we want to think that it had something to do with the zoning and the overlay and potentially the QOZs. The spending of that 19 block area was 12 times more than other areas of the city over the period of time. I want to jump to the city of Chicago because we could not and did not continue our study in NOLA. But this kind of study, I think, would be really fascinating and interesting for many in planning, because what we wanted to do in Chicago was very similar. Now that we were able to get the city of Chicago and their planning department, businesses, public folks, nonprofits to get together in terms of being that P3 GIS unit, what other questions did they have? They wanted to be able to just see, not particularly ask the question, what happened to spending patterns when different events occurred? And what level of granularity could they see? Well, we really could get down to a daily basis, but there are limits in terms of proprietary information and secrecy on businesses. So we were able to, from January 2020 to August of 2020, take a look monthly at not only the change in spending during our first, I call it, wave of the pandemic, but also some different types of events that happen. So I think more than anything, it's really just an interesting way of looking at, in the future, what happens if we expand the CID to 30 blocks, the before and after? How much more businesses are involved? In this case, on March 18th, well, even just before then, March 14th, there was, the mayor of Chicago had said, we're considering locking down the city, shutting it down. And on March 28th, the strict stay-at-home order came in. Makes sense that spending went down. And then it kind of stayed down and hovered. And then the stimulus checks came in. It would be more interesting to see what happened and what they spent on, but it was said that there were a lot of televisions. So, that's all I was told, but that may not be true. I would think that in more of the communities, it was just the basics. Okay. On May 1st, there was another stay-at-home order. And then the George Floyd protests came about on May 30th. And there were different. So there are different kinds of sociological issues that could be measured. June 3rd, there was a partial reopening of the city. And I think that this kind of data in and of itself, and we're talking about public, private, community data, is and will be the great equalizer. It does take a lot of time, a lot of effort. But I think this is the way, especially since many of us are just coming out of being virtual, we can still connect with many of the community, be able to get access to data that we hadn't in the past, and tell, I think, a greater, more comprehensive story, and make sure that the community voices are heard. The story about New Orleans, you can download that. And what I wanted to share with you was just a bit of the story, what we learned and what we heard from the community about this particular project. It will take about 3 minutes.
The world is made up of communities. Every neighborhood has a story, and those memories are still alive in the community. I grew up in the 7th Ward of New Orleans, this area of the city that is now known as the Claiborne Corridor. This was a neighborhood of wonder and excitement, of cultural traditions, of family gatherings. And then residents talk about the monster. When the interstate was built in 1967 through eminent domain, we lost 326 Black-owned businesses. We lost intergenerational wealth, opportunities to invest in our own neighborhoods. Claiborne Avenue went from being one of the most successful business districts in the southeastern United States to being the least successful business district in the city of New Orleans. But the vibrancy is coming back to the street. And I believe that the data insights will help us to grow that and to formalize it in a way that helps this to become a destination.
As a data fellow for the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, my job has been to try to develop a new way for data to be used by the Claiborne community to see if they can encourage investment. The Claiborne Innovation District is just a 19-block area within the livable Claiborne corridor. There's literally hundreds and thousands of people on a daily basis driving over the Claiborne Innovation District. What they don't know is on the ground, there's a vibrant neighborhood that's growing and it's going to continue to grow. But they needed the information to show that people are rebuilding in the neighborhood, and that's what we're providing. An important part of the work that we're doing right now is to try to make sure that we get different types of data that will help explain the buying power in the neighborhood. There's municipal data, community data, and anonymized and aggregated spending data. So for the community data, we physically walk out into the neighborhood, we take our clipboard and we'll make a map of the property conditions. And putting those all together will give a clearer picture on what the buying power is of a neighborhood. Full strategy of place-based development. Yes. I think that's what it is. Well, you know, like 138% increase in consumer spending. I mean, that's beyond our wildest dreams. Every bit of information you have amplifies the success of residents being given control of their own community. So that is the power of the data. That is the power of knowing. We still have a lot of work to do on Claiborne, but the data insights were an amazing catalyst for our community, because now when I walk down Claiborne, I can see the businesses starting to fill in. What's wonderful about this particular neighborhood is when you look up and see that bridge, even though there's a lot of people passing you by, you can see the city and you can see growth. It's going from hopeless to hope.
Great. Well, thank you. So I'm going to turn it back over to John.
Michelle, quick question. The data, is that available for folks, you know, in other places? How would folks go about getting the data if they wanted to use data like this?
Well, there are two different tools, and I'm going to say the Geo Insights is, as I say, there's the MasterCard side of the house, and then there's the philanthropic side. So on the MasterCard side, that is a service. And so for cities and municipalities, there certainly will cost less, but that particular service can be purchased. But there's a few other tools that are in development that they'll be able to get limited information, but I think the Geo Insights is probably the best. I mean, there's also, you know, ESRI has similar, you know, data, but you really have to know how to use mapping services. So this is why I like this particular tool. You don't have to be, you know, you don't have to focus on learning mapping before you can get the information out.
Great. All right. Well, I'm sure there will be more questions coming. And so our next speaker is Patrice Gillespie Smith, and she is the Chief Operating Officer for Friends of the Underline, which is transforming the underutilized land below Miami's Metro Rail into a 10-mile linear park, urban trail, and living art destination from the Miami River to Dadeland South. For over 20 years, she's worked as an urban planner across the nation to create walkable, livable, and resilient cities. Prior to working for the Friends of the Underline, she served as a senior manager of planning for transportation resilience for the Miami DDA, the Downtown Development Authority. She led the Neat Streets Miami and developed the Safer People, Safer Streets Action Plan and the Miami-Dade Complete Streets Guidelines. She has also created transportation solutions in many leading cities around the country, including Seattle, St. Louis, Columbus, Ohio, and across South Florida. She's a graduate of Marquette University and holds 2 master's degrees from Ohio State University. So Patrice, welcome. And we're excited. This is the first presentation I've ever been in where we've talked about not one, but 2 revitalizations under transportation infrastructure.
Well, thank you so much, John. And what an honor to follow up Dr. Thompson's presentation. I agree, John. I love that Dr. Thompson's talking about an adaptive reuse, and then I am talking on a smaller scale, I guess a narrower scale and longer scale. And that's why I started this presentation with this picture, because some people cannot grasp what's happening underneath the infrastructure. And thank you, because of Dr. Thompson, it's very clear that we are reusing the space below our Miami Metro rail. And those of you who are not familiar, it looks like quite a few of you are from South Florida, but we're one of the few cities where our heavy rail goes above ground. And so that is a picture right here of the Underline for our Holiday Village small business launch. And you can see we have all sorts of small businesses. Our sponsor is accompanying me there, and she and I are looking on at an amazing presentation by the local band called the Booker T. Washington High School Band. So it's a pretty cool event, but I'm glad you're all familiar, so I don't need to explain a whole lot about what we are. But I do want to, before I get discussing any specifics, I would like to talk about something that I think all planners should remember, is that transportation is a vehicle for business. It's kind of that great equalizer where everyone can be a part of transportation. And I'm sure all of you remember those planning history courses you took where cities were founded at the convergence of rivers, which obviously is a transportation mode. And businesses enjoy that proximity. You know, they didn't found their first business 5 miles from the river. They made sure that their business was very close to the river. And then obviously the benefits are no different with a multimodal trail. And these stats here are part of something that was released not too long ago, the Florida Outdoor Recreation Economy, talking about how much those multimodal trails contribute to the state's overall economy. Pretty big numbers there. And that's something we often forget because the price of our infrastructure is never, it's probably 1/10 of what, for instance, a highway is, or recently the city of Miami is going to be looking at a $800 million signature bridge, which Dr. Thompson, for years, they went back and forth, should they keep the bridge or take it below ground? And again, they chose to keep it above ground. And again, it decimated a historically Black community. And so, but we apologize for this, and we shouldn't. I love that this report really embraces the value that these multimodal trails bring to our state of Florida. Whoops, sorry. So the next, and also we don't want to forget that why are multimodal trails equitable? First of all, there's no barrier to entry. You don't have to buy anything. You don't have to buy a car. You don't have to buy even a pass to the Metro Rail. And it's free and accessible 24 hours a day. It also, in Miami, where we are experiencing a housing crisis, it reduces the housing plus transportation cost. In Miami, that's 51% of the average Miamian's total income. So imagine immediately losing half of your paycheck just to housing and transportation. That's before you think of food, any kind of clothing. All of those basics are immediately whittled down. And transportation here in Miami is 20%. That was before we had inflation. That was before the cost of gas increased. Obviously, it also increases access to transit. It provides that first and last mile connection, and health incomes. Very important there. We shouldn't underestimate that. Not only physical health, just because it creates a more active community, but also mental health, especially on the heels of COVID. We saw so many people just clamoring for a space to connect, and we provided that. And finally, what I'm going to talk about today is offering a free place for businesses to launch. In a time when many businesses went under because they couldn't afford to keep up that rent, we offer a free place for you to conduct business. So about the Underline. Thank you, Dr. Renee, for explaining to everybody what the Underline is. We are 120 acres. We're going to be 10 miles long when we're finished. We've only opened our first phase so far. But I think the important part of our mission really is tucked in that second sentence, that we are connecting people to their environment, each other, and we create a safe, healthy, equitable, and sustainable community. And so what does that mean exactly? How do we connect people to that? Well, along our 10-mile trail, we have access to 9 million transit users, 250,000 residents, 14,000 businesses within 1 mile, 4,000 new trees are going to be planted. And we really like to talk about the economic development opportunities. So that's new jobs, new homes. As we all know, in Miami, there's lots of construction, but we also know that long-term, the trail creates new jobs. So quickly about our demographics, just for those of you who don't know Miami, there's often this assumption that because we go south of the river, that we're only connected to wealthy people. And really, it's important to note that 36% of the residents that live along the Underline are making $50,000 or less. So that's definitely not wealthy, and $50,000 is not even considered median income in the city or in the county. So we're below that. And it's important to point out. And then our demographics for age are interesting. We are skewing younger there. You know, the bulk is 20 to 40 years old. So that is exciting, right? That we have that opportunity to grow folks that are fully employed have the opportunity to access us, access the transit that we're along, but also hopefully not having to worry about purchasing a car. And those connections span beyond people. It's also organizations. We have great connections to nonprofits. And we like to point out all the neighborhoods that we touch along the way, and the institutions. Very important. We touch more than 24 schools, but one of those major ones is the University of Miami and the 30,000 students and faculty and staff that are associated with it. And then, of course, hospitals and nonprofits. And then lastly, businesses. And these are really not the businesses, the 14,000 that we've mentioned, but these are new businesses that we've brought to the Underline. Benefits, again, you know, we do like to remind people why multimodal trails are so important. We are connecting to the 8 transit stations. We enhance cyclist and pedestrian safety, which for those of you from Florida, you know, the state of Florida has more cities on that top 10 list than anyone else. That's the top 10 worst cities for pedestrians and bicycle fatalities. So the state of Florida has proposed a Vision Zero philosophy, meaning they want to get their crashes down to 0. It's a very ambitious goal, and we love it. It's just, you need the infrastructure to support that kind of idea. And we believe a dedicated bike and walking trail is the first step. Equitable access, as we talked about. We also, this is the piece I talked about, we encourage active transportation. So every $1 spent on walking paths and programs could return, oops, and I'm sorry, sorry about that, could return approximately $3 in medical expenses. So it could reduce approximately $3 in medical expenses. So a huge ROI there that, again, very few people think about. It's often, what are we going to do about drivers? What are we going to do to reduce the price of gas? And I just, you know, planners, that's what we used to discuss in planning school. I think it's still a very relevant discussion. And value creation, very important there. We're already seeing a proposed, this was a study conducted by HR&A. They said we would see a $300 to $485 million increase in assessed values, and then a $10 million increase in incremental tax revenue. So again, that's money that goes back into the general revenue fund to support services. And then the bigger numbers are that $3 billion in new development. And again, you see some of that other spinoff from that. So lots of benefits that come from what someone would argue, you know, a small or a small scale transportation project. And going to use this, so I don't. So just quickly again about the Underline, where phase 1 here is half mile and Brickell. Phase 2 is under construction. It will open next year. That will bring us to almost 3 miles. And then the remaining 7 miles there will begin construction at the end of this year or early next year. And that phase there is a $100 million project. So that's going through an award process with the county right now. And that has to be finished per a federal grant that we received by 2026. So it's a very fast moving project. Here's just a quick overview of what you can expect. Hopefully some of you have already come to the Brickell backyard. That's our first phase. You know, not only did we improve the area beneath, so it's about 100 feet across, so the 100 feet for 1/2 mile. So, and we created new amenities for the community to experience, but we improved just 4 intersections in that area alone. So we expanded, doubled the area that you can cross for bikes and peds. We provided enhanced crosswalks so the motorists can see it. In some cases, we have flashing beacons. So again, even if you're not going to use the park, you will experience the benefits. And just some quick pictures. This is what we call the river room. Every night it's full of people walking their dogs. We've got an outdoor gym, which every afternoon is full of people playing basketball. Art, we are a public art destination, and I'll get to that later. This is more art, talking about climate change, more art. And then something we're very proud of is all the free programming we're offering. So this is something we do every month. We call it Family Day, and hundreds of kids pop out. This was our first foray this Saturday. We didn't realize how popular it was, I think, first thing in the morning. By the end of the day, we were overwhelmed. So now we've actually moved the location of that because it is so hugely successful. And then we offer free, this is called Junior Heat Skills, because of many of our sponsors. And this is a fabulous partnership where the Heat brings in their coach. Kids get to enjoy free classes. It's been a huge hit. And again, so we've talked about a couple things in a vague overview, but the Underline has been very intentional in creating a DEI commitment. Our board said, we cannot avoid this issue. We can't ignore this issue. We must embrace it. So the first thing they did is they passed a 5-year strategic plan that required DEI key performance indicators. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. Then they also said, let's set some goals for hiring practices. So we are proud to say that over 50% of our staff through security and maintenance are people of color. And then the other 50% are honestly Latinos. So it is hugely, we are really trying to represent. And then in our office staff, more than 25% of our folks are people of color. So we really are embracing those metrics, and we continue to stay committed to that. And as I discussed before, programming, art, our business support, and our board diversity, we have set a goal of 25% of our board to be people of color. We are not there yet. So we've asked our nominating committee to, help us recruit a more diverse board. And then something to really point out is we have free access to almost everything. We have free Wi-Fi, we have free programming, we have free classes, as I mentioned before, you name it, we're offering free services and strategic partnerships. So we have formed a lot of great partnerships with those nonprofits that I mentioned earlier to help make sure that we are we're a small staff. So we know we can only do so much. So we're partnering with organizations like Big Brothers Big Sisters, Connect Familias, Amigos for Kids, to bring their programming on our space. And during COVID, that was hugely successful because a lot of these nonprofits had no place else to go. So when they came to us, we said, of course, you can have free services here. And it's been a very successful partnership. And let's see. One thing I didn't mention is affordable housing. And that's a frustration of ours. The Atlanta Beltline, our sister project, who has one of the most incredible leaders, has an incredible impact on Atlanta. They are purchasing land to make sure that they have affordable housing. So we knew we couldn't do that. So we asked ULI if they would conduct a study for us, and they did, to look at affordable housing opportunities. But I just wanted to show you 2 neighborhoods that we're in particular concerned about. The first one is West Brickell. So our little trail runs right under here. And if you look at these 4 areas, you can see the discrepancy in rents. Obviously, at one point, it almost doubles. So at the north, you're doubling what you're paying here at the southeast. So that's already showing the developmental pressures. But what's even scarier is what you look at just adjacent over on this side, how much the market rent is. So we're not talking about double. We're talking about quadruple the rent just on this side. So as you can imagine, as the development pressures go west, there's going to be a real big reckoning, unfortunately. So all the employees that we see walking to the grocery store to their job, I'm very worried about. So this ULI study not only pointed out this concern, but offered some great recommendations to our elected officials that we're hoping they take. And I should say the Department of Transportation and Public Works has announced that they have 1,400 affordable housing units planned along the entire Metro Rail. So that's along the 21 miles. So we are hopeful. Just a quick overview of another historically Black neighborhood called West Grove. Again, if you look at the top matrix here, this is pointing out what the rents are in West Grove. So again, ranging from $460 to $1,000, quite a big discrepancy. But what's even more alarming is looking at the surrounding areas, what those rents are. And you can see the pressures are near impossible to ignore. So that's something that does concern us. And again, we're working with the community. This community is extremely organized, and so they have formed an organization that has to approve every development that comes into the West Grove, which is a fabulous idea, a great way of making sure that the right development is happening in that neighborhood. So again, so what are we doing, within our purview? So we talked about programming. This is an example where not only are we programming, but we're empowering. This is a group of teenagers that worked with us last summer as ambassadors. So not only, one could say, oh, you're helping these kids. That was not the case. They were helping us 100%. They offered tours every Saturday to anybody who wanted them of the Underline. And these kids gave the best tour, the most exciting tour. I think, we're so excited. We're trying to renew this partnership with them because the way they could tell a story was far better than any of us. So we are super appreciative. And then this is another group of kids we partnered with who started their businesses on the Underline. And actually, these are just the winners. I'm just noticing now we had 8 businesses launched on the Underline. High school kids went through an entrepreneurial class, and the winners through a Shark Tank competition, the winners were able to bring their business on the Underline. And again, we experienced the rewards far more than they did. Several of them received scholarships. They received jobs. This one gentleman here, Malik, is like, he volunteered for us Beyond. So we actually helped get him a job. He said after this, he was going to college. So it was an incredible relationship. And we were able to do that because of a grant. So we are trying to influence what we can. We're very proud of that. And then because of the success of that, Bank of America approached us and asked us if they could launch a small business holiday village. So 10 businesses launched on the Underline over the holidays. And again, the exposure that they received, they said they couldn't have received anyplace else because we've had more than 1 million visitors. So our foot traffic is incredible every day. And so these folks here were trying to figure out, how do I grab somebody as they're trying to catch the bus? Or how do I get somebody as they're trying to catch Metro Rail? So it was a great experience for them. Who I don't even have pictured here was a trainer. And I thought, how is he going to get any work? Because he's not selling a physical thing. He ended up telling us he probably was more successful than anyone because he was able to recruit all sorts of clients just by standing on the Underline. And it's that relationship that we had with Bank of America and FIU, who trained these businesses before they came on the Underline, that really helped launch their success. Many of them were able to not only get more clients, sell a lot, but take their business to the next level. So they're pursuing a physical bricks and mortar location as a result. So super productive, super mutually beneficial experience that this is our first year we've been open. We've only been open for 12 months and we're just dabbling, we're experimenting, but these are things that we'll definitely be going forward with. So with that, I conclude my presentation.
Well, thank you so much, Patrice, and to Michelle for 2 very, very fascinating presentations. And I invite folks to post your questions in the chat window, and then I will call upon you to ask your questions. But I can get started while folks think about questions that they may want to ask. And so what's really interesting to me about both of your presentations is the linkage to business, and particularly to the opportunity for you know, Black-owned, minority-owned businesses to compete in kind of almost like a new realm of a retail world. In some ways, I was thinking about the contrast of these particular corridors in contrast to, like, say, the suburban shopping mall. I was back in New York in my hometown this last week, and I went to the Poughkeepsie Galleria where I grew up. And I remember 30 years ago when it opened, it was like, you know, it was so exciting, and it was kind of like the cutting edge of, you know, we got a Galleria in Poughkeepsie, and now it's on the verge of death. And so what you both showed is the opposite. You're showing kind of you know, what looks to be like corridors that are on the verge of blossoming. And so I just thought, you know, how do you connect that to the equitable, obviously, you know, equity and transportation? I'm curious to get your thoughts on how all of that kind of, you know, connects. And of course, Michelle has data to show that it connects, but even like from a planning standpoint, you know, how did, what is the way in which we can make more of this happen?
I don't know if you want to go first, Dr.
Oh, no,
Thompson?
Patrice, I'll follow you.
Okay, I was just going to say, we have the luxury, we're in South Florida, so we technically could have, you know, open air businesses year round. There are some crazy rains that we experience during the summer, but, you know, so it is a luxury for me to talk about that versus, you know, somebody up in the Midwest may say, but I only have 6 months. But COVID has really turned everything on its ear. I think, you know, for so long we assumed people had to be inside of a building paying rent in order to get a revenue. And now they're realizing you can do it with a very small startup cost and do it right outside. So I think there is a real, you know, we're removing a barrier to entry that used to be rather significant. And when we spoke with FIU, they said, it's more significant than you realize with an immigrant coming from another country, that they look at that and they throw their hands up when they see the cost of rent. So we feel very fortunate that we have the luxury of being able to offer people this space for free.
I think what, you know, again, I think the weather can be a good thing or not, given the last few days of NOLA weather. But I think some of the things that I found fascinating are the change in policy. The idea that mobile vendors or food trucks there was a lot of consternation and almost backlash from a lot of businesses. And now that's opened up. So I think that some of this has to do with the licensing. In terms of technical assistance, just even for the Claiborne corridor, the money that I mentioned, actually the $1 million that came from the Ford Foundation, was to provide technical assistance similar to what you were talking about, Patrice, and just like business development and banking, even opening a bank account and getting credit, or how to clean up your credit. So there's a lot of, you know, a lot of organizations are focusing on what we would consider kind of the basic skills, which are just, you know, how do I get a bank account, and, you know, and how do I make sure that my credit score can, you know, how do I get it to improve or clean? Those types of things are where they're at. But I agree with you again with COVID has changed a lot of ways of thinking, but I think that the ability to work remotely and to be able to move your business to being virtual has changed things a lot too. So I think the conversation is a little bit different now, John.
Thank you. And I see Serena has a question. Serena, would you like to ask her a question?
Well, yeah, I heard both of you mention, you know, opportunities to set up either a nonprofit for the, I'm guessing for the day, or a pop-up business in these locations. So free is one thing, but also, you know, what is the permit process, like you were saying, for undocumented people or for others who are just a little concerned about getting involved with the government? Like, so have you simplified that, and how do these entrepreneurs know about the opportunity?
Yeah, permitting is a huge deterrent. We would love to get out of the permitting business. oftentimes when a big event comes, they say, we'll do everything except for the permitting, and we push back and say, no, you have to do the permitting. But with those small businesses, we've been fortunate enough that the county will allow us to assume the liability. And again, you're right, it's for a temporary, maybe 2 weeks here, maybe 30 days here. So we don't have to pursue long-term permitting. Should we choose to keep permanent businesses on the Underline, it will be a more serious permitting process. So we'll work with the small businesses to help get them through that. But you're right, like the insurance that's required will be a barrier. It will be a hurdle for some folks.
So I think I want to go with the formal process that you talked about, Patrice, but then the informal. So over the weekend, there was, as I say, in New Orleans, you plan a party and celebrate it before the party, then you have the party, then you plan and have it after. So you can't get permits for all of that. So there was a couple in Congo Square near the Treme, there was a big event. And the one thing that I do know now, that there's a lot of informal economies. So instead of buying, the $4 bottle of water, I walked outside and there's a guy selling it in, out of the back of a wagon. So I think that part of this in terms of what we're really talking about is how do we establish and help support businesses to move into the formal economy? I think there's definitely ways of doing that. I think it's a little bit better and more streamlined. I'd like to see that the Office of Neighborhood Engagement in New Orleans is really now engaging and working with city councilors, and they have a very active economic development arm with the new mayor, LaToya Cantrell. So I think some of this is coming from the top down, but realistically it's from the community, and it's also philanthropy has played a big part, especially post-Katrina.
And again, please, even if you just indicate that you have a question so I can call on you in the chat window, but I'll take the opportunity to ask another question that I'm sure folks are thinking of is around the gentrification. Patrice, you showed, kind of the rents going from, $600 to $700 to, market rents in kind of the more nearby neighborhoods of, over $2,000 a month. And, and so on the one hand, market rents are market rents because, that's what people are willing to spend, right, to live in those particular neighborhoods. And presumably the more affordable rents, right, isn't necessarily just a reflection of the fact that those are cheaper apartments. They're probably also in many ways substandard living conditions. And so I'm curious to kind of get your thoughts, both of you, on this tension of gentrification, but at the same time, how do we upgrade affordable housing? And when I say upgrade affordable housing, I mean, a lot of those people paying $600 to $700 a month probably aren't living in the best conditions, right? So we want to see people upgrade their living standards, but at the same time still be able to live in the neighborhood that they've lived in and not be displaced. And so what are your thoughts on gentrification and displacement around this topic? Michelle, you go first.
Sure, I'll jump in. Oh, it just so happens that I'm teaching a course on gentrification in historic districts, and Majora Carter, who lives in the South Bronx, just so happens her book, brought her book into the classroom. But the focus of her work is how to make sure that people can remain in their neighborhoods. But truly, what are you talking about in terms of, like you said, substandard housing, lack of services, intermittent buses and transportation? I mean, these neighborhoods kind of have it all. In New Orleans, there's also the issue of life expectancy. I mean, there's a lot of quality of life issues beyond gentrification, not beyond, inclusive of gentrification that has to be looked at. And I want to say, fortunately, there's just a lot of motivation around, especially post-Katrina, about neighborhood organizations pushing the government to say, we want better. You need to come forward with better plans and manage our money better, or we're going to do it ourselves. So I think that is, it's still not the answer to how can we have better housing, but I see there more activity from the ground up that is happening in New Orleans. And there is, in terms of the argument in the classroom, I say to the students in the very beginning, I said, I don't really think gentrification exists. I just think it's neighborhood change. Gasp, horrible person, right? And so then we take a look at, is this part of the natural order of neighborhoods developing, growing, dying, and rebirth? I think we also have to look at the definition of whether we're talking about gentrification because it's social, economic, whether it's about race. So I think some of these, I really do think are kind of these natural evolving neighborhood issues. But I think what we're talking about is, are we moving, eliminating, pushing out people because they have no other place and no other ability to pay these exorbitant rents? On a personal note, my daughter just moved from Skaneateles, New York to Miami, and she's been crying about her rent. So when I saw the 2,000 plus, I thought, there you go. And she works for the University of Miami. So I'm glad I don't have to deal with her rent issue. Okay.
So
but it
true.
is for those folks in New Orleans who, again, have are in the service industry, have limited or no health care, transportation issues. I wonder if again, the issue of gentrification is just one of their many issues.
So true. And Dr. Thompson, I really like that you posed that question about gentrification, because I have a 15-year-old son who keeps on saying to me, why is gentrification bad? Things improve. And I go, wait a minute, that's my son asking that question. So I'm glad you are looking at it. It's true, things do improve, but I think the fear we have here in Miami is that displacement. And in Florida, there is a prohibition for inclusionary zoning. So that's a real concern, is that the only way government is allowed to dictate affordable or workforce housing is if they own the land or if there's an incentive. So Miami has gotten creative and has said, oh, you want to add some height to your building, why don't you add affordable housing? So in Miami, where there's very few things that are A, subsidized, or B, mandated, I thought that was very clever, a very clever way to, at least try to address that concern about displacement. And definitely, and I'm pointing to that because it's right outside my window, but that West Brickell neighborhood, there are I think there's 2 remaining single family homes, and the rest, it's all being transitioned to high rises. So I do worry about those folks who were walking to their jobs. We already see down in the Keys, which is just south of Miami, a lot of the housekeeping staff there are taking 2-hour bus rides just to work in a hotel. I mean, think about the quality of life impacts of that. So, we do hope that affordable or workforce housing is maintained close to all the access, the multimodal trail, but the transit as well.
There's a question in the chat, but I just wanted to also note that I've been working with the South Florida Community Land Trust and that the Housing Link Coalition that received a $5 million grant, which isn't really all that much, to expand affordable housing opportunities in South Florida near transit-oriented developments. And as a part of that similar research that Serena and I did a couple of years ago, we found, that there are initiatives in other cities where they're providing funding for affordable housing to combat the gentrification issues. Unfortunately, it takes way more than $5 million. I mean, I think, I think honestly, $100 million probably would barely make a dent in the problem, especially when you consider the fact that to build one 150 unit apartment complex alone costs about $100 million, just one building for 100 apartments, right? So, we hear these numbers like, oh, 5 million for affordable housing or 30 million for affordable housing. It's like, and then you look at one apartment building that costs $100 million to build, and you're like, wow, that doesn't really take you very far, right? So to me, we really need to start thinking about, are we really funding, affordable housing, in a meaningful way? But there's a couple questions here. One from Laura Phillips, and Laura, if you're the same Laura from New Orleans, it's good to see you. And she asks, I don't know if you're here, Laura, if you want to ask the question yourself. Are you here?
Yes, I am. Sorry, I have a loaner laptop and my the camera doesn't work. But yes, I am the Laura that took some of your courses, John, and New Orleans.
It's great to see you. I could tell by your voice. Welcome.
Well, thank you. Thank you. My question is about the neighborhoods around the elevated freeway in New Orleans. And the reason I'm asking this is because I guess if it's true, what I read, then this points out that we as planners shouldn't make assumptions about what neighborhoods want. So I had read that there was a planning process done in that neighborhood, I don't know, in the last 10 or 15 years. And what came out of that process is that generally most of the people who lived in those neighborhoods decided, we don't want to take I-10 down. Mm-hmm. We don't want it down because if it comes down, then the gentrification in our neighborhood may be more extreme, may accelerate more quickly. That in effect, now that infrastructure is there, it's securing their homes for them. And I'm just wondering if that is true, because if it is true, many planners, the popular notion these days is, let's take all this infrastructure down. It ruined our cities. But we need to ask the folks in the neighborhoods what they would like, because if this is true, they want to keep it to protect their own homes.
So thanks, Laura. There were multiple studies, and there's been different types of groups. I'm trying to be politically correct. I'm not sure why, John, what happened to me. So I'll just say that folks weren't listening. Well, the idea every time I talk about this, it just bothers me that a planning firm received $1.2 million to do a study. And if they had just talked to the community would have said, no, we don't want this taken down for a variety of reasons. And we could have taken that money and built affordable housing. So that kind of drives me crazy. But there are folks out there. And again, we have to say, who are they? Are the folks in the neighborhood? Are they investors? Are they the mini Whole Foods that decided to invest in the neighborhood, that want to make sure that there's more traffic going on the streets than the elevated highway? I would say that, what came down to, and came out of even the study that John had done, and even afterwards, that the residents at this point want to live with and under the interstate. Well, I forgot to mention, of course, it's one of the most important things, is that former Mayor Landrieu is now heading up the infrastructure bill nationally. And New Orleans is listed as an area where there should be, air quote, consideration to bring the interstate down. And when I read that last year, I said, of course, thank you, federal government. What can we do? And this is where the mayor and a group are now forming a coalition to be able to talk about, what do we want? How do we want to use the money? How do we want to bring and have the interstate in areas nearby and through the whole corridor? What do we want? And give that to the federal government instead of vice versa. So yeah, there's still tension around it, but I think you read it right in terms of what the community wants is what we need to do. And I think that's what's being done now.
Great, thank you for that information. Yes, I noticed that as well. I actually work for Federal Highways. I'm a planner with Federal Highways, and I know that there's a lot of emphasis now on what they're calling community connections and complete streets and reconnecting communities that were divided by highway infrastructure. But I think in New Orleans' case, it's very interesting to point out that the neighborhood, you're not revitalizing it just to revitalizing it. You're revitalizing it and you want it under this infrastructure. The neighborhood wants to keep the infrastructure.
Yeah.
And
It's going to be different for every city.
Yeah. But that's one way to look at it. And we should be aware that that's a choice a neighborhood may make. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and I would also point out, that I don't know if there's like a necessarily unanimous decision on these issues. I think there's probably differing opinions within the neighborhood. But the New Orleans went through a very, very steep escalation in housing prices from about 2006 to about 2016 or so, 2017. It's kind of leveled off a little bit now. And so, I think when a lot of these conversations were happening, you were seeing an annual appreciation of rents and housing prices that was on the order of 15 to 20% per year. And, I kind of wonder to a certain degree, if that may have been a reaction at that point in time. Now, housing prices in South Florida are increasing 20% per year, right? And so we're kind of going through, this experience here in South Florida. And so the point I want to make though is that I think a lot of times expensive housing is often reflected in people's decisions on other things, like a piece of infrastructure, and whether it should stay or remove. Anyway, that's just a thought. There's two questions. We might be able to have time. We've got about 8 minutes left. So it looks like Steve Leinhart, would you like to ask your question?
It's okay. I see it. I mean, I can.
Well, let me do this. If I'll come back to the question, but I'd like to kind of allow people to ask their questions. So it looks like we have another question from, is it Takara Nicole Thomas?
Yep, you got it. Thank you.
I'd like for you to, I want to go to the live questions and then we'll ask those who are not live questions afterwards.
Okay, cool. So my question is basically about exclusionary design we're still kind of dealing with the effects of it right now today. So like an example, in New York City, the bridges leading to the beaches were designed intentionally low to prevent the buses from going. Communities that, will have public outcry about streets and they'll get them rerouted, or rerouting the streets so that traffic will go through particular neighborhoods. How do we deal with this historical, the remnants of that, and it's still going on today when we're trying to talk about equity in the physical design?
I want to say what comes to mind, and then Patrice, please jump in. Was one of the issues about reinvestment in the transportation for along the Claiborne corridor. And also, it's funny because again, New Orleans is unique in a lot of ways. I mean, I didn't grow up with a streetcar or a subway, so so it's very different for me. But the idea that there was in one of the recommendations was that we wanted to make sure that the streetcar went from downtown across the bridge all the way through the lower Ninth Ward. And so millions of dollars came in from CDBG and all these different places, because the reality was the people in the service industry who lived in the lower Ninth Ward or the outer areas were relying on those bus services. And the streetcar didn't go down far enough, right? So part of it is, it goes back to who's designing the plans, who's in control of the money, who has the loudest voice. So I My approach is as I'll call it a technologist. I don't go out in the community and, wave the flag and, I don't fight I fight City Hall with data and information and let the folks who can go and get into the ear or want to get into the face of city folks. That's how I believe we can do it best. And it sounds a little cheesy, but it just seems to me like the idea of the voting makes the difference, right? Who you have in office, and I look at the administration from Landrieu to Mayor Cantrell, and again, Mayor Cantrell, there's things that she's saying and doing that people are listening to. The housing issue, there's a lot of Airbnbs. Now we have Airbnb rules, and there's a lot of issues around one-for-one replacement of, if you get rid of an affordable home, you have to replace it with another. There's legislation now that makes a difference. It doesn't cure everything. The only other thing I want to segue into in terms of under the bridge, what I found really fascinating that people didn't really complain, I did, about the freaking noise, the constant hum of traffic. Well, when I was down there hanging out, eating my crawfish, I forgot about it because the music got louder, right? You're there dancing and enjoying yourself. So I think some of these physical features that seem to be a barrier, people are incorporating and using and making the best of.
Yeah, I think your question is really interesting, Takara, because it's sad. There is still a mentality in South Florida that only the disadvantaged need to walk and bike. And so why would we invest in any infrastructure? And the odd thing that works, instead of pointing out the dozens of bikes that are at every construction site in downtown Miami, instead of pointing that out because people think we're making that up, is to point out that some of the new companies that are moving to Miami expect this quality of life. This is an indicator of a quality of life. The Underline is featured in both the cities and the counties, all their marketing materials to every tech company that's trying to move here, that they want to move here. And they realize this is a sign of a forward-thinking community. So, we could talk about safety, we could talk about equity. Unfortunately, what they're going to listen to is the economic development potential that comes with it.
Yeah. Can I just throw one more thing in that was really, again, you think that I said, bravo, John used to be the head of our, our UNADI or Transportation Institute. And some of the things, the seeds that were planted, John, have come to fruition, like these bike paths. And I mean, I lived and worked in Boston, and I'm now NOLA and other areas. It's hard to retrofit. It's hard to have enough, it's wonderful in these beautiful renderings, but the idea of being able to figure out having enough space to have the cars and the bikes and the parking and all of these things, NOLA's trying to make it happen. So what happens? Blue bikes come, right? Other different resources come to try to encourage biking, which is kind of interesting. So accessibility issues, they're not no more. But when I had my students go out and do a map of where are all the blue bikes, well, guess what? There's not one blue bike in the lower 9th ward or near there. And the cost of the blue bikes, don't get me going on blue bikes, the cost of them for local residents was the same as out of towners. I don't mind, and I'm still not a local after 15 years. I want those out of towners to pay for all of those extra cars and bikes. So some of these issues are great in terms of, I love that, Patrice, you said $1, and walking, or, it reduces healthcare. These are important, but how do you get them implemented? It's more money. Go ahead, John.
Well, speaking of that, real quick before we wrap up, Patrice, did you want to answer the question where the funding's coming from briefly in Underline?
Sure. I feel like, Steve, you're a plant for us. Thank you so much for asking that question, because it's not quite figured out. Over the next couple of years, we're fine for maintenance, but we are looking at some long-term agreements with the local municipalities. Right now, we've been fundraising, and we do have a small trust fund that the county created for the next couple of years, but we are very nervous about that long-term commitment, and we're working on that. Honestly, when I say every day, we're working on it every single day.
Well, it is officially 1:30 and I want to close this on time. Thank you both. Thanks for all the participants. We've had 80 people stay to the bitter end, which is a sign of how great this forum was and how wonderful your talks were. So thank you both. And just to, Serena mentioned it, this is actually part of our 50th anniversary for the Center for Urban Environmental Solutions. So this is kind of our kickoff event for our 50th anniversary. So sign up for our newsletter, hughes@fau.edu, or you could just go to our website and contact us. If you have any follow-up questions, send us an email or reach out. We would love to continue the conversation, and keep a lookout for other events that we'll be planning later this year, both through the DEI committee for the Department of Urban Regional Planning, as well as Hughes. And of course, again, thank you to our partners and sponsors from the Gold Coast section of the APA, American Planning Association, and the Treasure Coast section of the American Planning Association, which is part of the Florida chapter. Don't forget to collect your AICP credits. Go on there and make sure you just type in the name of this webinar and you'll be able to claim your credits. So without further ado, thank you. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event. Thanks again, Michelle and Patrice and Serena and everyone.
Thank you, John. And Patrice, I look forward to seeing you. I'll be coming down to Miami.
Let me know. I'll give you a tour.
I would love it. All right.